Okay, you've now read Finesh's article on putting Paul in his place, and you're probably wondering, at the end of reading that, well, who was Paul and what hope do we have of ever reconstructing the man himself? Well, as Finesh has pointed out, even from the very earliest times in the first and into the second century, Paul's own disciples attempted to press gang the apostle into causes that were facing their communities then, some decades and even many decades after the death of Paul. For the authors of Colossians and Ephesians, and we'll say more about the Deutero-Pauline text soon, for these authors, encountering opponents in their own communities after Paul's death, they wanted to appeal to Paul's name in order to quash that opposition by using his authority posthumously. From these letters emerges what Victor Finesh has called a Paulist built, a sort of new, exalted view of Paul as apostle and martyr, whose sufferings are said to have completed Christ's afflictions and who have been, to quote Finesh, like Christ's own on behalf of the whole church. Okay, where this becomes, of course, problematic for us is that one of the major sources that we have for reconstructing Paul's life, not his letters, mind you, I'll come back to that too, is Luke's Acts of the Apostles. In fact, Luke, while writing a story that focuses first on Peter and then on Paul, tells us certain things about Paul that doesn't quite cohere with what Paul himself writes in his own letters. And indeed, such is the somewhat jaundice isn't the word, but somewhat, shall we say, gilded view of Paul that we find in Acts, that certain things are clearly missing. One of the things that Luke never tells us is one of the things that we actually know about Paul, and that's that Paul actually wrote letters. There's nothing in Acts of the Apostles about Paul's letters. And in Acts, Paul becomes, if you like, the chosen instrument who strives laboriously during his own life to proclaim a gospel before the Gentiles, kings, and the whole people of Israel. In Acts, the Lucan Paul mirrors in a very important way the Lucan Jesus. And so, like Jesus in Luke's Gospel, the Lucan Paul in Acts heals the sick, raises the dead, is falsely accused of apostasy and blasphemy by the Jewish mob, is arrested, is tried before the Sanhedrin, the Roman governor, and even Herod Agrippa, all of which sounds very familiar, which is not to say it's historically accurate, but the telling of it has been shaped in a certain way so that it acts as a reflection of the life of Jesus, so that Paul emerges as the quintessential Christian and follower of Jesus. Acts is, as most scholars would agree, a Greco-Roman hero tale whose protagonist, Paul, embarks on a perilous journey to the ends of the earth. He's caught up in civil strife and riots, he survives snake bite, he suffers imprisonment and shipwrecks, and ultimately preaches the gospel in Rome, the centre of the world's greatest empire. In reaching Rome, the Paul of Acts completes the mission that was first begun by Jesus in Galilee and prophesied by Simeon in the Jewish temple, that the gospel would be preached to the ends of the earth. There is a corresponding Paulist built as well in later Pauline texts like 1 Clement, the pastoral epistles 1 and 2 Timothy, or 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, as well as those of Polycarp of Smyrna. The author of 1 Clement places Paul alongside Peter as one of the apostolic pillars of the church, whose great endurance to the end of his life wins him a place in heaven. The pastorals, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, hail Paul as the preeminent apostle, whose faithful endurance and righteous living is a model of all Christian living. Now, this is a far cry from Paul's own self-abasement as the least of the apostles in 1 Corinthians, and his gospel proclamation of a radical freedom in the spirit. In the pastorals, Paul's gospel is rendered down to mere appeals for strict adherence to sound doctrine, as we find in 1 Timothy 1:10-11, and godly living in 1 Timothy 6:3. And Paul, as Victor Furnish says, is himself reduced to a guarantor of apostolic doctrine and becomes the prototypical Christian man. At the hands of these, his later disciples, Paul's story becomes hagiography, and his memory is invoked only to press conformity upon what today we might call the pew warmers. The man becomes the myth, the prototypical convert, the exemplary Christian, the model martyr, and only one of the apostolic pillars of the church. Paul has been put in his place within the evolving orthodoxy of the church, but in so doing, he has been, I think, removed, as Furnish would say as well, from his historical place, from his culture, from his religious heritage, from his social world, and even from the churches and communities of his own making. So, in this unit on Paul, we are presented with an opportunity, I think, to rediscover the historical Paul, to read his letters afresh, indeed to grant primacy to his letters over other sources, to consider his message anew, and perhaps to find a new place for Paul, even in our reflections on our own faith journey.